to the Tennis IQ podcast. I'm Josh Berger.
And I'm Brian Lomax. And our topic today is self-talk. Self-talk is one of the most basic aspects of the sports psychology world. It's something we talk about often with tennis players. But if you think about your own self-talk, you may not even be aware of its nature. It's so basic that many of us don't even think about the sort of the content or the tone of the self-talk that we have. Yet it is so important. It's one of the first things that sports psych professionals like Josh and I talk to players about, we ask about, we may even have assessments about the nature of your self-talk. And so we thought today would be a good day to discuss what is self-talk, um, different ways of looking at it, and then giving all of you some thoughts on interventions or strategies to improve self-talk over time. Um, One of the reasons I think it's important, Josh, is that it has an effect, whether positive, negative, productive, destructive, over things like your focus, your confidence, your self-image, your mental toughness in general. Your competitiveness, certainly during a match, can be driven by your self-talk. Um, and I think if we broadly just for now, I think we'll hone this down as we go along. But if we broadly define self-talk, it's really that inner dialogue. It's that statements or phrases that we say to ourselves, um, and we're doing this all day long. And it's very difficult to have a completely clear and blank mind. And sometimes we're more calm, other times we've got a lot of chatter going on. And how a tennis player manages that, not only during practice in play, but also off the court at other times, is really an important factor in their mental toughness and competitiveness and all those other factors that I named. So just wanted to get your opening thoughts on self-talk and how important you think it is.
Yeah, I would agree that it's a critical component of mental toughness. Um, we're talking to ourselves all day, um, and most people rely on sort of these default states of self-talk, which tend to be um, full, rather critical. There's self-doubt. There's comparisons. There's a mistake takes place, and rather than seeing it objectively, taking ownership over it or identifying with that. So I think without thinking about self-talk specifically or addressing it and coming up with specific solutions, people tend to fall back on their sort of default states, which tend to hold people back, specifically in a sport like tennis, where we've talked about is a it's one of the reasons why it's so challenging is that it's a sport of instant feedback where after every point you're getting that feedback of whether you lost or you won that point. And without with most people, without training in this way, without necessarily thinking about their self-talk, they ride that emotional roller coaster where you win a point and you're so excited, okay, that was an awesome point. And then you lose the next one and you're beating yourself up or you're criticizing yourself or my backhand is horrible or I can't serve or catastrophizing it that way. So being able to, I think, we're going to talk about a few different approaches here, but being aware of what your current self-talk looks like is certainly an important step in starting to lay that out and be specific about that. And then, I think we'll talk about a few different ways to best approach self-talk and what are some solutions to starting to move in a positive direction and use self-talk and use the way that you're communicating with yourself as something that really drives your performance rather than holds you back.
Right. Yeah, I agree. Um, Perhaps the next thing we can talk about is some ways of categorizing self-talk so that I think everybody understands, how you can look at it and begin to understand your own self-talk. So, and some of this will there have been a number of research studies on self talk. There have been a number of ways of categorizing it and then trying to tackle it from those different categories. We did do an interview with Dr. Judy Van Ralt some time ago. She's an expert on self talk, and so that would be a useful episode to listen to as well. But we'll be getting into a little bit more this topic broadly here today. So when I think of self-talk, these are some of the different dimensions that I think about. There's rational self-talk versus irrational self-talk. And there have been a number of studies that show how being more rational in the moment can actually be a performance enhancer. There's a guy named Martin Turner who was in the UK, and he's done studies on this type of thing, and has had a lot of success training people to be more rational about how they look at certain things, and then they end up performing better. I think sort of the classic dimension that most of us think about a positive versus negative self-talk, and you brought up, Josh, the idea of the critical voice, and that is where a lot of us kind of default to. Um, Tennis players seem to be perfectionists for whatever reason, or there are a lot of perfectionists in the sport of tennis. That can make it challenging because tennis will not be perfect. You will not win every point. You will make mistakes. So that in itself is a challenging thing to deal with. Then there's automatic self talk or automatic thoughts versus a slower process of maybe more deliberate. And we'll get a little bit more into that as well, distinguishing between your thoughts and your intentional self talk. So that's another dimension. And then we also have something called functional self talk, which I think is more on the what we want to be doing. And there tend to be two categories there. There's motivational self talk, helping our confidence, helping our intensity. Come on, let's go. Versus instructional self talk, which you might think of as your coaching voice. You mentioned the fact that most of us do not have coaches on the court, but you do have a coach in your head, and that coach will generally use instructional self talk. Uh, Move your feet, hit high and heavy. So it could be tactical or it could be just basic skills, etc. So I think beginning to think about these dimensions, and they really all apply, I think, Josh, in some ways. Positive and negative could also be looked at as rational and irrational, but there are some things with positive that they don't have to be rational. It could be more on the motivational side and so forth, right? Positive and negative, I think you could also reframe as productive and destructive, more productive and non-productive in some ways. So I think these dimensions are interesting and may also, as we go along here, help people understand what am I experiencing on some of these dimensions? What does my self-talk look like? How might I categorize it? In terms of what we just mentioned.
Yeah, I like how you laid that out. I think that's really important for people to know these some of these different dimensions. And I think specifically when we think about that functional self-talk and where we want to be, understanding that it's that combination of motivational and instructional is really important because you really need both. Ideally, there will be moments on court, whether it be when you're training or even while you're competing, where you need to give yourself a certain instruction. Maybe it's something about your technique. Maybe it's something more strategic and in terms of the patterns that you're trying to employ. Or at a certain moment in a match, maybe you really need that motivation. Maybe it's break point and you need to remind yourself, like, come on, like, let's go, like, focus in here. um, or you're low energy. We've talked about energy levels in other episodes, but that might be a specific moment where you need to pump yourself up and use the type of motivational self-talk that we're referring to here. So I think it's, as people listen to this episode, as you examine your own self-talk, thinking about what are the types of self-talk that are ultimately going to be most productive and helpful out there. And I think breaking it down into those two categories of those two types of motivational and instructional is a good way for people to start to look at that.
Think about what Rafael Nadal must have been saying to himself in that Australian Open final, that other match he played against Sebastian Corda at Indian Wells, to be able to come back when, in some ways it appeared that those matches may have been over. Yet he had to have said something to himself that helped him to keep fighting and fighting. Certainly, a long career of being that way is helpful, but no one is really that way by default. There's training that goes into that. There's training that goes into helping you develop that really good internal dialogue. We did also do an episode with Dr. Laura Swettenham about think aloud as a way of also understanding your self-talk and recording yourself and so forth. So that also we're not going to talk so much about that today, but that would be a good way to start to break down the content of what you're thinking and saying, and it may also be surprising. But I agree, motivational and instructional is really important, especially when we get down to being intentional with our self talk, and making both of these around things that we can control as a strategy, right? But I think a good first step for people is, how do I understand what I'm saying to myself? How do I understand the impact of that? And a good first step is simply coming up with a self talk log. What are some things that you say before you play a match or a practice, during, after? And those are different things. How do I set myself up for whatever's going to happen today? It could be positive, negative. Oh, I'm going to lose this match, or I suck, or what are you saying during, and then even after the match? How do you explain it to yourself? What are those types of things? Um, what am I saying? I guess after I perform poorly. What am I saying after I perform well? Um, what do I do if I'm on a team and when maybe one of my teammates performs well or doesn't perform well? Right. This is a sport of comparison. You know, if I lost my match and my teammate won her match, how am I processing that? What are my thoughts there? Um, am I thinking a lot about what other people are thinking about me? That's where a lot of thoughts end up going to. Is been a lot of anxiety and lack of confidence is often based on the thoughts of other people's evaluations of us. And so, what you can do is simply take a notebook and start to write down some of the things that trigger self talk with you. You could look at it more time based, of before, during, and after, or you could say, when this type of thing comes up, tend to say this. When I make a mistake, I tend to go this way with it. And it just really begins to help you understand what's really happening. And that would be useful for working with somebody like me or Josh to understand what it is you're saying. Certainly think aloud and recording yourself, although that takes some training and practice and so forth. But one of the reasons that think aloud is effective is we often forget a lot of the things that we say, right? There's a memory decrement between when you actually say something and then a couple hours later when you're trying to record what it is that you said. Some of us may be better at that than others. Um, but I think it's at least a good way to understand your self-talk. And as you're looking at this log, begin to think about the impact of some of these statements on, again, those things like focus, confidence, self-image, competitiveness, etc.
Yeah, I think what you're touching on is, it leads to awareness. Being able to write down your self-talk, being able to maybe record yourself or say it out loud, like the think aloud protocol that we've discussed. It leads to an athlete being more aware of the way that they're talking to themselves. Where if they're constantly in that default state and never really examine it, it's tough to sort of gain that clarity and understanding and awareness of what's going on and the impact that it has. So I think that that first step really is awareness and sort of laying it out there, and then having that conversation, really trying to understand what is the impact when I tell myself I suck, or when I tell myself my backhand is horrible, or you know I can't serve, or any of these sorts of things. What does that do? How do After I say that to myself, how does that generally impact the next point? How does that generally impact my confidence levels? How does that Do I feel, focused and ready for that next point, or am I, lost in thought, not thinking about my strategy and my game plan going into that next point because of the way that I'm talking to myself? So I think it starts with being aware of your current self talk, and then starting to lay out, what are some of the consequences of it, and thinking about some of these specific phrases that you use. And again, they're one of the challenges here is, yes, there might be certain things that you say out loud, but much of it takes place inside your head. So, you know, we're relying on the individual's memory, and especially if it's been, a few hours or the next day or a couple days, it can be tough to sort of think back and recall exactly what was said. Um, so that's one reason why the think aloud protocol is helpful, because it helps people gain awareness through really saying it out loud in the moment. But for most people, I think you do have to rely on memory to a certain extent, and you can start to keep a self-talk log, and think about what are those things that you're saying to yourself on the practice court, through the ups and downs of competition and training. What are those things that you say to yourself during matches, especially during some of the key moments? Maybe you're down a break, maybe you just lost a set. What does that look like? And then, starting to think about what would be a better way to talk to yourself in that moment. But starting to lay it out there and write some of these things down and track it can make a big impact.
And I think that's one of the first exercises that I will do with somebody is exactly what you're talking about, Josh. When if we've identified self-talk as being somewhat problematic for their mental toughness and all those other dimensions, we'll try to understand, okay, what triggers this, and if you keep a self-talk log, we'll be able to know that. You and then let's look at everything that you're saying, and as you stated, what are the consequences of those things? And yeah, they have consequences on a different number of dimensions. It could be your focus, your motivation, your confidence, etc. But I think it's also then good to look at the actual content of what is being said. Is it actually even true? Are we, overblowing this, catastrophizing this situation? Are we using language like "I have to," or "I need to be better," or "I should win"? Things that may not be true, they may not be rational, and help the player understand and perhaps even come up with their own countering arguments about why what they're saying doesn't make any sense.
Right.
Certainly doesn't help in the moment. Um, I'll often ask players, try to guess how many studies show that critical negative self-talk is a performance enhancer. It's zero. And yet we all seem to default to that. And then common rationale for it is, well, I need to motivate myself, I need to be tough on myself, etc. But an easy way around that would be, okay, you're playing doubles. Would you ever say to your partner some of the things that you say to yourself? And almost always the answer is no, because that wouldn't be very nice. It wouldn't help my partner. Would you allow your partner to talk to you the way you talk to yourself? No, I probably wouldn't allow that either. Yet somehow you have deemed it okay to speak to yourself that way. And people get that. They understand that. It doesn't necessarily cure it right away, but it does give them pause about, okay, why do I think this critical voice is necessary? we actually know that the opposite is true. Self-compassion, kindness, because you need a friend out there. Like we said, Josh, and there's no coach generally. You need somebody who's on your side out there. And if your own mind is not on your side, you're in some trouble. So you need somebody out there. And there's a researcher at the University of Texas named Kristen Neff. She studies self-compassion and has shown that people who are kinder, more compassionate with themselves actually take more responsibility for their mistakes. They're actually able to forgive themselves for that and move on, where the critical person can't let it go and therefore doesn't really fix it. Just tends to ruminate over that mistake, that loss, etc. And so that process we were just describing is really a classic cognitive behavioral therapy technique or rational emotive behavioral therapy technique that helps us reframe what we're thinking, what we're saying. So going from some statement that may not be true or irrational, simply unhelpful, to coming up with something that would be more productive in that moment, right? And a lot of that self-talk is more automatic. It's harder to control. And we'll talk about long-term strategies for dealing with that. But if we can then follow that thought up with a more rational, productive thought, that's maybe the slow part of our brain, the more analytical part of our brain, then we have a chance to still perform well on the next point, the next game. It's when the sort of irrational, unproductive thought or self-talk goes unchecked and that becomes the dominant. That's when we really run into some problems during a match.
Absolutely. I think a lot of people fall into that critical frame of mind in terms of their self-talk. I was having a conversation recently with a baseball player, and the fact that baseball, first of all, is a sport of error, is a sport of mistakes and a sport of failure, where you can, you if you have 3 hits out of 10, you're doing quite well. You can have a great career. Um, but what that means is for a batter, you can expect to, um, you know, to not be successful 7 out of 10 times at least. Um, so with this conversation, he was saying that he might go 2 out of 3 or 3 out of 4 in a given day at the plate, but where does the focus go? The focus goes to the mistake because it's almost an expectation of success every time he's out there, where you hit a double, or okay, it's a nice whatever, nice line drive, and you get on base, and that's expected, and you don't even necessarily think of that. But where does your mind focus on after the game? To the strikeout or to the pop out. And I think it's the same with tennis players, where when things are going well, it's almost like oftentimes people fall into this trap where it's almost okay, that's expected, that's the way it should be, rather than giving themselves credit and being positive during those moments. But then when things aren't going well, that's when they start to catastrophize. That's when it can feel like it will always be this way, um like things will never change. So I think starting to catch yourself in those moments, first of all, giving yourself credit when things are going well and being positive and recognizing it in the moment. But I as it relates to the criticism, keeping things in perspective certainly goes a long way. um, so just wanted to add that in as well.
I think you're right. I think we do tend to look at those mistakes. We tend to look at the successes as that's what it's supposed to be, rather than, and so what ends up happening there is you develop a self-image around mistakes. You identify more with failure than success. This is something that Lenny Basham, in his book With Winning in Mind, talks about how we need to study our good shots. We need to study our success. Success leaves clues. We want
Yep.
to repeat success more rather than avoiding failure. So if we know if that batter, as you said, went 3 for 4, now there are a lot of variables that go into hitting in baseball, right? But are there some things that we could look at in those 3 hits that Now we can replicate a little bit more, a little bit more. The clues, the success, that's where it lies. And so the more that we look at those successes and understanding, yeah, that's me, that's what I want to be. We use self-talk in those moments to reinforce our self-image rather than using self-talk in a critical way on the failure piece to build your self-image. As you noted in baseball, 3 out of 10, 30%, right? Batting 300 is good. So, um, we're going to fail a lot. We don't want to identify with that. We want to understand the reality of the game. The reality of the game is batting 300 is excellent. So let's look at how I'm getting to 300, not how I'm not getting higher than that, right? So I think the success piece is really important. And knowing that the way you talk to yourself does build a self image, whether that's a great competitor, winner, or on the opposite side, I always lose. It's 5-2. I always blow this lead. Start to create some self fulfilling prophecies that we don't want to have based on your self talk. So and your self image. So it's really important, I think, that when we're thinking about performance, that we're studying the good stuff and using our self talk intentionally to build a positive self image because that's who we want to be. We all want to be great competitors. We all want to be great closers in matches. I want to be super focused and confident in tiebreakers. I want to be clutch. Your self talk is so important to helping you develop those aspects of your self image.
Absolutely, absolutely, and through our experiences in these situations, in a tiebreaker, in a clutch situation, how do you handle it? And how can you, reflect on those performances that you've had in order to, improve your self-image, first of all, and not just focus on those negative aspects of what happened, but remember it, sort of as a whole, be more rational about how you reflect in it, and not just focusing on the negative aspects, and try to learn and improve from it, and think about, okay, next time I'm in that situation, how would I want to be talking to myself? What are some specific things I would want to say to myself when it's 5-all on the tiebreaker, and I know that this next point is, could potentially swing things one way or the other. What do I need to say? In tennis, we have generally 20 seconds or maybe 25 seconds in between points. How can I best use that time and communicate with myself in a way that I'm setting myself up best going into that next point? Being able to put whatever just happened behind me, not hold on to it, go into that next point with confidence and also with a plan. Also, feeling prepared and knowing how I want to try to set up that next point. What is my intention going into the next point? Um, so I think that's really important whenever a player is playing, but especially in those clutch moments, especially when the match is on the line. It often is the difference maker between players. I maybe I've mentioned this or haven't, but my business is tiebreaker psych. And the reason why, it's sort of a double meaning in that, yes, part of it is, okay, we want to be playing our best during a tiebreaker, during a big moment, a fourth quarter, or whatever it may be. But also that the mental game is often the tiebreaker between competitors. It can be sort of the difference maker there, and how you talk to yourself is a big piece of that. So being intentional, learning from our performances, learning from those situations where maybe we don't talk to ourselves so well, where on a given day maybe things aren't going so well for us. Maybe we're playing less consistently than we'd like. Maybe we're playing aggressively, but our shots just aren't as effective. They're not penetrating the court like we'd like to. And we notice that we're in a very critical frame of mind. How can we learn from those experiences, knowing that we'll have a lot more matches in the future? How can we learn from those experiences so the next time we're in the same situation, and we will be, there will be other clutch moments, other tiebreakers, other third sets. How can we learn from that so that the next time around you can, I think, take, rather than just reacting and going back to that um, sort of default state, how can you slow things down a little bit? I think that's going to be a key here, because if we acknowledge that for most of us that default state is more on the negative critical side, what sorts of methods do you have to slow things down, to go from that point of being more automatic with our self-talk to being more thoughtful and coming up with more of a response than a reaction? And I think the breath has a big role here, where, rather than playing the point and going straight to judgment, being able to take a breath and take a moment to reflect on it and choose a response that you've planned out, rather than simply going to your reaction and whatever sort of pops into your mind first, based on how you're feeling in that moment. Planning, choosing that planned out reaction. I mean, there are certainly different approaches here. One approach is scripting out that reaction and scripting out that response. And really coming up with a script for how you want to talk to yourself in that moment after a mistake. Let's just say you can certainly script that out, and what are the key things that you want to say to yourself after a mistake, or going into a really critical point. Maybe it's a tiebreaker, maybe it's a deuce point, maybe it's break point against you, or a second serve, or whatever it may be. But starting to script that out, starting to plan that out, so that you have that resource and that tool to fall back on, to refer to, rather than falling into these traps of our default states.
I think one thing you're getting at, Josh, here now is sort of differentiating between our thoughts and our intentional self-talk. And I think this is a really important distinction if we want to be improving how we speak to ourselves and be more productive on the court. There's a technique, acceptance commitment therapy. It's a good strategy for thinking about your thoughts and thinking about your self-talk in different ways. And it's to understand that thoughts are just thoughts. They're not facts. And the more that we just accept that this is what our brains do, they're almost like involuntary thought generators. None of us can really control what we think. I mean, just try to sit quietly for 5 minutes, and lots of thoughts that you could not have predicted will come through. But what can we control is how we choose to respond to that. And too many of us, I think, listen to those thoughts as if they're facts, as if maybe it will come true, or whatever. But the more that we understand that they're just thoughts, our brain just does these things, we don't have to listen to them. And in effect, we could just say, this is a classic sort of exercise with acceptance commitment is thank you. Thank you, Brian. Appreciate the input. And then connect with, what do I really want to achieve today? Connect with your goals, connect with your values. And some of that scripted self-talk that you're talking about, Josh, should be in line with your goals and values as a competitor. But the more that you're able to just accept and push that thought away, you diffuse its power. It doesn't have a hold over you anymore. It doesn't have to become part of your self-image. And now you can move on to what it is you really want to do. We all have these thoughts. The goal is to not let them have so much power over us and realize that they're just thoughts. They're not facts. They're not real necessarily. Now let's get back to what it is that we want. And by connecting with what your goals are for the day or for your career, what your values are as a competitor, you connect with that. Have your self-talk script, whether that be situational or it could even just be general. It could be, all right, today my script is always going to be breathe, watch the ball, reset. And when I notice some erroneous thoughts, okay, that's what I come back to. Just breathe, watch the ball, reset. And the more that you say that, it's starting to perhaps help you block out some of those automatic thoughts, but the automatic thoughts will creep in. And when they do, you try to recognize it, let it go, and then come back to your script of the basic elements. I'm using those three things as My basics that I will often use, but everybody's different. You can come up with something else. It could be more about your footwork, active feet, follow through. Doesn't always should probably shouldn't be so much technical, but um, that's what Dan Abrahams talks about in his book Soccer Tough, distinguishing between um, listening to yourself less, talking to yourself more. Right. So what are we listening to less? Those thoughts. But we're talking to ourselves more with intentional things, things we can control, things we want to be thinking, things that are in alignment with our goals and our values. That's probably what now Rafael Nadal is doing between points when he's down. He wants to win, and part of his values as a player is being a great fighter, being a great competitor. So he aligns his thoughts and his self talk with that, and then it helps him to keep going. So I think this is a really interesting way for people to look at their thoughts a little bit differently, and then bring it back to some intentional ways of how do I actually want to be, how do I want to perform, um, how am I building my self image about what I do on the court.
Definitely. And we have the nice thing about this is that since, as we mentioned, we're constantly talking to ourselves, we have countless chances to practice this. It's yes, some of the maybe most impactful moments where the consequences of our thoughts are going to be most um, most obvious might be on the court in a key moment. But when can we practice this? We can practice this anytime we're on the court. We can practice this off the court as well, how noticing how we respond to different situations, catching ourselves in that response, and maybe thinking about how do we want to, what is that ideal response, or how can we commit to a certain type of action in that moment. um, I think as it relates to those ACT, those ACT techniques, it's really, accepting that these thoughts do come up, and not just ignoring them, not pretending that they're not there, or
Or not fighting
wishing
them.
them,
Yeah.
wishing them away, fighting them, exactly. But let's acknowledge them, and then let's commit to, how we want to respond anyways. Not saying, oh, just because I'm having these thoughts of self-doubt, or imposter syndrome, or whatever it may be, that I can't perform on a given day, because then we're just going to be performing on those days where all the stars align, where we're feeling great, where our self-talk is great, where we're feeling confident, where we're feeling motivated. As a competitor, you have to be able to perform every day regardless. And I think there will be days where you feel better physically. There will be days where maybe you feel more confident, or more composed, or more focused, or whatever it may be. So acknowledging, where you're at on that day, acknowledging those thoughts as they come in to your mind, but choosing that response and committing to that response ahead of time and in the moment is key in terms of still being able to perform at the level that you want to and that you're capable of.
The more that you use those scripts, I think the more that you will improve the quality even of your automatic thoughts. That I don't think they'll ever be perfect, but the more that you focus on, hey, these are three things I'm just going to be saying in this situation or for a whole match, it starts to work its way in. And I do believe that there are some long-term strategies that one can employ to develop better automatic thoughts. Um, I think simply reading about good perspectives, and we've mentioned a bunch of these on the show, but reading them repeatedly. So things like The Winner's Creed by Bill Tim, Bob Bowman's 10 Golden Rules, which you can also can search and find that. Um, Terry Orlick's The Wheel of Excellence. You can find articles about that. And the more that you read through these things, the more they begin to influence your own personal philosophy of how to perform, your own personal philosophy of performance excellence. So I'm a big believer in repetitive reading and studying of great perspectives, really helping to change what you were talking about, Josh, those default modes of thinking. Think of this almost this type of reading and studying as a software upgrade to how we typically think. Let's begin to think in better ways, ways that promote performance excellence rather than ways that more or less get in the way. There's a lot of fear based thinking in our default mode. There's a lot of thinking of negative consequences, what if scenarios, generally towards negative outcomes. What if we could update that through some repetitive reading and maybe even some writing, doing some journaling? Write some affirmations that you think are good for you. Read those often. I think the more that we're taking some off court time to study better ways of thinking over time, those you're going to notice, I believe, that your automatic thoughts will become more and more productive. They'll probably become closer to some of those scripts that you've been writing. You'll always still have some of those like, oh, why'd you do that type of reactions. But I think you'll more quickly shift to the productive, functional response, motivational, instructional, etc., getting back to what it is that you value and what it is you really want to do in that moment.
I think that's great advice. You know, catching yourself even off the court after a mistake and noticing, how do I talk myself? I mean, I think there's countless examples throughout the day. You forget something, you forget an appointment, or you make a mistake, you drop something and it shatters, right? What do you say to yourself? Do you say, oh, I'm such an idiot, I always do this, right? Or can you think about something that might be a better way to respond? But again, there are countless ways to practice this, and I really like, Brian, that you brought up reading and consuming the articles or videos or books that help to instill a better mindset, learning more about the types of mindsets that are productive. I think another thing we could do is, we've talked about press conferences, but watch some of the champions of the sport and how they reflect on their own performances and how they talk about coming back. We talked about Rafael Nadal and coming back. I think a couple other players come to mind here in terms of on the women's side. Iga Swiatek, who I know we've talked about in the past, who's becoming the top player in the world. Is a great example of watching one of her press conferences. Carlos Alcaraz, who I have a feeling is a player we're going to be talking about a lot in now and in upcoming years, is just he has had some unbelievable performances. Just yesterday, from our recording, he came back from 5-2 down to Stefanos Tsitsipas, one of the top players in the world, to win the next, I think, 7 games to bring it to go from being down 2-5 to winning that set 7-5 and going up 2-0 in the next set. And talking about how he was able to do that and fighting for every point and believing, right? I think part of it is being able to believe and talk to yourself in a functional way that promotes that self-belief, that promotes confidence, even in really tough times. When you're down 2-5, your default state for just about everybody is not going to be full of confidence. It's going to be maybe frustration, maybe self-critical, probably lacking the belief that you can come back and win that set or win the match. So I think there's a lot to be learned from the champions of the sport of tennis and beyond. And I like that. I really like that suggestion of sort of filling your head with positive examples from coaches or from athletes, because I think there's it starts to change that default setting.
Yeah, and those types of responses to adverse situations are not unattainable. They may feel that way at first, but the more you engage with this good type of self-talk, and maybe at first it is beginning with scripting, but then over time, as you read and you study and you immerse yourself in the world of, performance excellence, you begin to adopt those things, and they become really part of who you are. One of the players I work with, um, he loves using some of the mantras that we've talked about, Josh, and he just uses them throughout. Like everything is practice. Keep expectations low and standards high. Things like that. He really adopts that, and loves it. He listens to the winner's creed before every match. So he's engaging in all the things that you would want somebody to do, and it's really paying off for him. And these are not things that take a long time. Like it actually takes a longer time to physically practice tennis than it does to do some of this really kind of basic mental work around that voice inside your head. If you can really shape that voice to be one of a great positive coach, somebody who is a huge supporter of you, your biggest fan there, um, maybe even sometimes your best friend, someone who's kind and compassionate, helps you achieve what you want to achieve, right? Doesn't become a barrier to that, helps you have a positive self image. I think then you have gone a long way in terms of crafting that self talk that's going to help you not only in tennis but in your whole life. If you think about it, life is about performance. We're talking about one small aspect of it, right? Being tennis, and we'll often discuss tennis as a microcosm of life. But everything that we've talked about, Josh, I think you could apply to any context that you're performing in. And I know one of your favorite topics is mindfulness. Mindfulness is actually a great way to practice that acceptance and then shift, especially if you're doing a meditation in which you have some sort of mantra, because you'll notice the automatic thought, the thought that you really weren't trying to have, but you can push it away like it's a cloud, and then you come right back to your mantra. So that's a great way to practice that, and the better you get at that without judgment, you don't want to judge yourself negatively for having that thought. You'll get better at that on the tennis court as well, or off when you're criticizing yourself, etc. So I think this is such an important topic because along with body language and your breathing, it has a major effect on your body chemistry on the tennis court. And in order to perform well, you have to feel good on the court. You have to feel well. And if you're not feeling it in your body, you're not feeling right out there, yeah, your self-talk is part of that. And so breathing, body language, self-talk, they all work together to help you feel really good. And when you're not feeling great, you should probably just be working on those three things to help get yourself back into the match and playing better.
Absolutely. I think that's definitely something that people can, remember. Things aren't going well. Let's keep it simple. Let's focus on those key things. Your breathing, your body language, your self-talk. That will solve a lot of your problems. A lot of the things that could potentially be going wrong. Are you really tense on the court? The breathing aspect could certainly help. Are some of the issues that are arising due to your reactions after each point? The self-talk piece is going to have a big impact there. And I like that you brought up mindfulness and meditation because through training, through starting to meditate and starting to um, you know develop some of these mindful practices in your own life, you start to gain awareness of the thoughts as they come up, so that they don't just that they're not just impacting you and popping up, and you're reacting to them, but you can start to notice them and catch them. And again, we don't need to push them away and you know fight them and pretend that they're not there, but we can notice them and sort of examine them. And if you look at a thought, you notice that it doesn't last forever. It appears, and at a certain point it fades away. And I think through a mindful practice such as meditation. And again, it doesn't have to be particularly time consuming. It could be 10 minutes, it could be even less. Certain apps like Headspace, for instance, have 3 and 5 minute meditations as well. But starting to develop a practice where you're doing it consistently and getting used to it has a lot of impacts in terms of noticing your thoughts as they pop up, um, being comfortable with thoughts that emerge, not identifying with them, not saying, "Oh, okay, just because I'm feeling a certain way in this moment, that's who I am," or I am anxious, I am depressed, I am sad in this moment, and I am sad, but no, that's how I'm feeling in the moment. Again, just like that thought, that emotion will come and go as well. So, no, I like that you brought that up. I think that can certainly play a big role here. And I think as we think about this conversation in general, it helps us be aware of some of those default states. And as we start to implement certain intentional self-talk, we can start to be aware of the impact that has. We can, through training our minds and employing, meditation and mindfulness, we can start to notice, okay, when we think in a more functional way, how do I feel then? When I sort of rely on these default states and I find that over the last 10 minutes, I've been, rather self-critical, judgmental, and maybe there's a reason for that. Maybe you didn't sleep as well the last night. Um, Maybe something negative has happened. Maybe you have something else on your mind, but you can start to notice the impact of your thoughts on your emotions and on yourself, and you know start to catch yourself, start to notice that more, and then start to employ the intentional self-talk as sort of a remedy for that.
Yeah, self-talk is such a fundamental element in competitiveness and performance excellence, regardless of context. And so I think this has been a great conversation. Hope the listeners have enjoyed it. Thank you for listening. If you have any feedback or questions for me and Josh, especially relative to self-talk, please email us at tennisiqpodcast@gmail.com. You can also use the Twitter hashtag tennisiq. Additionally, please subscribe to the show on your podcast platform of choice, including YouTube, so you can be notified of new episodes. You can also check out our Instagram account. Thanks again, and we'll talk to you soon in our next episode.